Greetings everyone. So there should be no puppies or cats for this lesson, but who knows, we shall see. Anyway, let's make a start. So today we are looking at Xerxes' invasion of Greece. Now, obviously we've looked at various failed invasions in the past. Mardonius' invasion in 492 that's sunk by a storm around Mount Athos, and that's a little bit important. Well, it's very important for what's coming up next. We saw Datis and Artaphernes' failed invasion that got as far as Athens, but is then crushed at Marathon. And Xerxes learns from these two experiences and realizes that you've got to have a huge army, or at least he believes he's learned from these experiences and feels you have to have a huge army and a huge navy to crush the Greeks absolutely. So he spends a number of years preparing for this invasion. He doesn't just rush straight into it. However flawed his decision-making process is, actually he spends years getting everything together. So I think there's an element of, I don't know if Herodotus really acknowledges the efficiency of the Persian military and administrative system, but we can, if we peel back the layers of Herodotus's prejudice, perhaps we can see it. You know, Xerxes creates a whole series of supply depots. He organizes men from all around his empire. He has supply ships. He has supply trains. You know, leaving aside the kind of interpretation of all these sorts of things as hubristic and excessive, it's actually probably quite a well-managed, well-organized invasion, especially by the standards of the time. And so if you're looking at questions that are really focused on the Persians come the exam, then I think I would certainly consider that as a point in their favor if we're trying to take a step back from Herodotus. Obviously, if we're looking at Herodotus' depictions of the Persians, then yes, absolutely, these things are more pointing to the hubris, arrogance and excess of Xerxes rather than anything particularly positive. Anyway, let us move on. So what I'd like to do now is reread 7.33 to 37, really important chapters in Herodotus, and these are your go-to examples for Xerxes' hubris, and they're also covered in the next play that we look at, which is Aeschylus's Persian. So this is a section of the book you need to know really, really well. And it would be a classic little extract from Herodotus as well to come up in the exam. It's so famous, and the image there gives it all away a bit. You know, that image actually sort of sums up Xerxes rather nicely. You see he's on a sort of throne with parasols being held above him, surrounded by a mass of individuals, and then some people down on the ground before him doing rather peculiar things to the river, or rather the sea. So how do these chapters characterize Xerxes as hubristic and tyrannical, and do they characterize him in any other way, shape or form? As always, pause the video and see if you can come up with 4 or 5 ideas at least. Good. So let's have a look at some thoughts, some ideas. So Xerxes creates a huge bridge across the Hellespont with, and not only one bridge, he creates 2 bridges held together with these vast cables, and the production of these cables themselves is almost an act of hubris and great engineering and supplies and complexity, and these almost mile-long ropes. Think about how much they would weigh. Just creating 1 mile-long rope is peculiar enough, but creating 4 because they're used on 2 separate bridges is really quite spectacular. However, Xerxes builds these bridges and they are destroyed by a storm. A great storm erupts. Now this is really important because obviously this can be interpreted as the gods sending Xerxes a pretty clear message. You have tried to turn the sea into land. You're behaving in a hubristic way. You're behaving as a god. Therefore, you're going to be punished. And they're sending a rather relatively gentle warning. His 2 great bridges made of ships all tied together with ropes over the top and all that sort of stuff are smashed, they're sunk, they're separated. And you'd have thought that would be the end of the matter, but because Xerxes has got so many men, so many ships, and because he is so hubristic, he does it again. So he gets another load of ships and rebuilds these two bridges, 2-mile-long bridges, which is absolutely crazy from a Greek perspective. Now, because this channel, I call it a river by mistake, but it's not. It's a sea channel separating Europe and Asia. Because this, in a sense, had been responsible for Xerxes' losses and a bit of humiliation, he decided to punish it. Now, this is a bit weird, of course, but I think we need to remember that this is a god. The Greeks believe that there are gods in almost everything, and a channel, substantial channel like this, would absolutely have a god. There are river gods, there are even gods of little trees and things. So a significant channel between Asia and Europe would have a god. And so Xerxes, from a Greek perspective at least, is clearly, directly and physically attacking and abusing and insulting a god. So when he hands out 300 lashes to the river, tries to chain it in fetters, brands it with hot brand, and insults it. These are all very, very, very clear and direct insults to a god. Now, there's also an element of it being almost comically stupid. I mean, branding a river. I don't know. It just seems a little farcical. But things can be hubristic and farcical. Now, Xerxes then goes on to have the heads cut off of the engineers who built the first bridge, which is a kind of classic Persian tyrannical move. So these engineers did nothing particularly wrong. They built the bridge as instructed. The gods appeared and sunk the bridge, and Xerxes, in a fit of rage, chops these people's heads off. He is arbitrary. There is no law. They have no rights under the law. They have no isonomia. This is just, they die in a pretty horrible way because the great king is cross. No process. Think as hysterical as the Athenians can be, and as much as we wouldn't really want to be in an Athenian law court, there is still due process, if you like, and there is still a restriction on, there's still punishments connected to crimes, and you can defend yourself, and so on and so forth. But for these Persian engineers, the bridge was destroyed by a storm. Xerxes cuts your heads off. That's it. Now, the next thing that happens is, again, a further repetition of the idea that the Persians and barbarians don't really understand divine signs. So, the biggest divine sign is pretty obviously the storm sent by the gods, and that's ignored. That's misunderstood. But also, Xerxes sees an eclipse, and this is quite an interesting one, isn't it? If you think about it from a Zoroastrian perspective, you'd have thought this would be a really, really bad sign: the dark eclipsing the light. Is Herodotus showing some kind of understanding of Zoroastrianism there, or the other way around? Is it a complete lack of understanding? Would Zoroastrians really have interpreted the extinguishing of the sun as anything positive whatsoever? Anyway, they interpret it as the sun symbolizes the prospects of the Greeks and the moon your own. Now, this, perhaps this is true in a sense, and Herodotus is just showing what happens when you're too afraid to pass on prophecies to the king. So maybe the Zoroastrian priests, the Magi, realize what it says, but they're just too terrified, because what happens if you pass on a prophecy that Xerxes doesn't like? Well, he kills you, he cuts your head off. So maybe we're not supposed to read too much into it. Anyway, an interesting little sort of ending to this whole scene nonetheless. So, what does Xerxes do? Well, he goes and builds, another set of bridges, after the first ones were wiped out. So again, you just cannot get more hubristic than that. And this is going to be your go-to example of hubris: the bridging of the Hellespont and then the punishment of the river by Xerxes. Now, there we go. Another just quick bit of reading for you, and this is another story that is an absolutely brilliant story that characterizes the issues with Xerxes and tyranny. So stop this, have a quick read through two relatively short chapters, 7.38 to 39, the story of Pythias. So how does this characterize the tyranny of Xerxes and the Persian system? Read through for 4 or 5 minutes, see if you can come up with 4 or 5 ideas, because there's actually quite a lot of interesting stuff in terms of characterizations in this story. Good. Oops. So, sorry, I thought I'd done a little summary slide, but obviously not. So the story of Pythias is a really, really important one. Small but really important, because Pythias is the richest man in the Persian Empire apart from Xerxes, and he is still a slave. He is still punished. He is still abused. So you can see this huge gap in hierarchy, if you like. You've got the king, and then just this vast gap between the king and anyone else. Even this individual who you'd have thought would be supremely powerful is nothing compared to the great king. And when he asks a very, very, he gives everything to Xerxes, or offers to give everything to Xerxes, he's unbelievably generous. And then he makes a relatively reasonable request that, of the 5 sons that he's given to the Persians in the Persian army, that he be allowed to keep one to continue his kleos, his family line. And Xerxes goes absolutely ballistic. I mean, it's not, Xerxes doesn't just say no, which would have been a reasonable response. He kills his son and cuts him in half and marches the army through him. So this is a great example of just the arbitrary justice of Xerxes. Well, justice isn't the right word. The Persians do not have laws that they can operate within and under. It's just what Xerxes wants on any given day. Remember back to Artabanus and his speech. The only reason he wasn't killed was because he was Xerxes' uncle. And here we have Pythias, who's not a relation of Xerxes, asks a pretty reasonable question, and his son is executed, and the remaining 4 are forced to stay in the army. So, and from which they presumably die, because at least according to Herodotus, most of the Persians did. So it doesn't end well for poor Pythias and his family. So let's have a look now at 722 to 25. Now this is another important example of hubris, and this is Xerxes and his canal. So what I want you to do is stop, read 722 to 25 and answer the following questions. Why did Xerxes build the canal? And you'll have to think back there to 492. Was it actually necessary? How does it demonstrate hubris? How does it demonstrate the power of Persia? And this is an important little one that can be shown here. To what extent do barbarians have distinct identities? Now, do think back to, it's not connected, but do think back to Herodotus' other depictions in other places. The Egyptians, the Libyans, the Persians. Now we've got a little bit of an exploration of the Phoenicians. Lovely. So stop. That should take you, I don't know, 5-10 minutes by the time you read this and actually write sentences. And where all of these notes, or all of these sort of ideas that we're putting forward, you've got to be writing down in your notes. Don't just sit there and let the video flow over you whilst you drink tea and Snapchat or whatever horrific social media sites you're on with your phone. On the other hand, you've got to be taking notes as we go. So stop, and 5 minutes? No, 5-10 minutes, go. Good. Well, so obviously Xerxes is building the canal through the sort of Mount Athos Peninsula, because that avoids the area where Mardonius's fleet was wiped out in 492. So he's looking back at what happened in the past and coming up with a huge engineering project to fix the problem. And this is vast. This is crazy. Some 3 years were spent preparing the area. So this is a an obsession of Xerxes and the Persians. And I think another thing to bear in mind is that Greek is a rough, tough, hardy place. It's got a little bit of wealth, a little bit of fertile land, but not nothing compared to the East. I mean, they're probably pouring more than they would make in the capture of Greece just into this canal and into the bridge. So I think it's supposed to be excessive and ridiculous. So The next thing that Herodotus sort of points out, or one of the things he points out, is when we're looking at the difference between different barbarian groups, is the Persians, the Phoenicians. So these are a group of sailors who of a sailing culture, not dissimilar to the Greeks in some way. They've got a lot of coastal cities. They've got great trading networks. They are amazing sailors, and that's why you've got that sort of Phoenician-Phaeacian sort of connection in the Odyssey. And they are viewed with some respect by the Greeks, certainly in a kind of sailing sense and in a few other ways. And here Herodotus re-emphasizes that with the idea the Phoenicians showed their usual shrewdness in the way they build the canal. They build it twice as wide, so when bits kind of collapse in, it's still wide enough for the 2 triremes that Xerxes demands. And then Herodotus, whereas the other barbarians don't. So we're starting to see some barbarians are smarter than others. Think back to the Egyptians; they're more religious than others. The Libyans probably more kind of sort of sexual and uncivilized in a sort of city or polis-based way than others. There is some differentiation between barbarians, one would argue. Now, the next thing that we see here is Herodotus answering that sort of important question of why. Why does Xerxes spend 3 years digging a canal? And Herodotus says it was the sheer scale of Xerxes' relish for magnificence which prompted him to order the digging. And that is why he does it. He could have dragged the ships over. He could have avoided Mount Athos, dragged the ships over, and done that in, I don't know, a couple of weeks, perhaps, maybe a bit longer. But there was no need to dig this canal. But Xerxes did it because he wanted to impose his magnificence on the world. This digging of the canal is also quite important because it's a kind of another type of hubris, if you like, to the bridging of the Hellespont. It's a sort of mirror image. So the hubris is turning water into land, and this is turning land into water. So double hubris, attacking the gods and their divine world from 2 different directions. So what I'd like to do now, and this will take, 15-20 minutes, is have a look at the barbarian army and the description of the army as it's marching towards Greece. And you'll need to read 7.61 to 88. So there's a fair few pages. Now, what I would like you to do is identify the 4, or a few more if you like, most barbaric contingents of the army, and draw them and label them with elements that make them barbaric. So what is it about them that makes them extremely barbaric? You've got the Ethiopians, who are perhaps barbaric in one way, and you've got the Persian immortals in another. Now, what I would like you to do is to compare them to the Persian immortals. Now, you'll see a little bit of a description of the immortals on 7.41, which is important, and then a slightly longer description on 7.83. So have a look at the, they're not vast, they're only 6 or 7 lines, but have a look at some of the words, some of the ideas, some of the concepts. There's some very significant and interesting things here. So this task should take 15-20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. What I don't want you to do is, after 20 minutes, to have exquisitely drawn, one small sort of sword handle or something. It's not about that. If you really, really, really do not want to draw, then write the name of the barbaric group, so Ethiopians and spider diagram, off with their characteristics and the analysis, what makes them barbaric from a Greek perspective. But I think a little bit of visual representation is, dare I say it, fun sometimes. So, good. Right. So once you've done that, let us move on. Now, I think there's 4 key points that I'd like to bring up with regard to the immortals, because they're the sort of classic, well, not classic, but they're the Persian elite rather than a sort of classic Persian. They are the ultimate of Persianness in terms of warriorhood and Persian characteristics. So the immortals come to battle with prodigious quantities of gold. This is strange. Why would you take your gold into battle? It's crazy. You don't need gold for your battles. Later on, for buying stuff, sure, why not? But taking it into battle, feeling you have to display it all the time, is very Persian. Excess, luxury, obsession with wealth. They also bring their concubines in carriages. So concubines, sort of lovers, so not wives, but lovers. So very strange and weird thing to do. You've got wagons full of women, sex slaves, probably, possibly. But it shows that Persian excess. They can't be away from sex for any length of time whatsoever. They have to have their wagons full of concubines. These immortals are so spoiled or elite or different to the other members of the army that they have to have a separate supply of delicious and lovely food. And in terms of equipment, they've got spears, but they've got these sort of gold and silver pomegranates on the bottom. So they are quite dangerous. There is a certain element of respect for the immortals from the Greeks, but you compare them to the Spartans, and then we've got nothing. The Spartans, have in theory no love for gold. Remember, there's no currency in Sparta in order to avoid sort of that lust for wealth. The Spartans have their wives, but they certainly do not take concubines on campaign with them. The Spartans are in control of sex and sexuality. The Spartans kind of go the opposite way in terms of food. They have their shared food, and it's so revolting that no one's particularly bothered. The kind of pig's blood and vinegar all boiled together, deliberately disgusting to again discourage a love of luxury and that kind of thing. So again, they're kind of complete opposite. Spartans do have the Greeks do have some kind of decoration and would have polished their armor and they would have had that kind of the musculature displayed, and it's not as though they go into battle kind of dressed completely in beige, but their ornamentation is within the bounds of reasonableness, whereas the Persian ones, having gold fruit at the end of your spear, is just again that kind of obsession with luxury and softness that the Greeks would have found strange. So I think it is interesting and important, certainly for later on when we look at Thermopylae, to compare the immortals, the best of what Persia has got to offer, with the Spartans, the best of what Greece has to offer in a military sense. Now, another little thing that I'd like you to just have a quick flick through is 7.99, Artemisia. Now you can add her to your depiction of an army as well, if you like. And she's an interesting character because she is described by Herodotus as having formidable masculine bravery. She's leading the contingent from the city of Halicarnassus. So she is leading a sort of one of the best trained little. I think there's about 20 ships. So it's a small but very powerful, well-disciplined part of the Persian navy, or the barbarians' navy, and it would have been a bit of a shock to the Greeks. Well, actually it is, and the Athenians are so appalled and revolted by it, they actually offer a huge sort of bounty on her head in the battle. But anyway, we first see her in this depiction of the army, and I think it's important to have a think about these questions. What would be the impact of a female warrior on the Persian side? What would that trigger amongst the Greeks? And why might Herodotus portray her in a strangely flattering way? So have a think about those, jot down 3 or 4 lines, take 5 minutes or so, and then we'll talk about it in a bit. Good, so I think the obvious thing is Amazons. So when you have a female warrior coming from the east, you're just going to be screaming Amazons, Medea, that kind of exotic, powerful, Eastern barbarian queen, threatening male society, ordered male society with chaos and female sexuality. Now, interestingly, she is described, as I said before, as a kind of formidable masculine bravery. So Herodotus is quite strangely positive about her. And there's a few reasons for that. Well, she's from Halicarnassus, and so was Herodotus. So is it just a little bit of pride in, his own queen, even though he left and went to Athens? There's also a suggestion, although some scholars suggest that actually Artemisia's son who took over basically had Herodotus's family hostage, so he had to be relatively complimentary about the ruling dynasty of Halicarnassus. I don't think we're ever going to know either way necessarily. Now, moving on to the next scene. Now this is again some important conversations with between Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king, and Xerxes. Now, Demaratus was a Spartan king, and he was deposed by his political rival Cleomenes. And the way Cleomenes did this was by questioning his legitimacy. And if you're not a legitimate king, then you can't be a king of Sparta. Remember, you can be elected to all sorts of assemblies and ephorships and things like that, but the kings are sort of descended from the lines, these two kind of kingly lines. So you do actually have to be a legitimate son to be king. Now, Cleomenes bribed the Delphic oracle to lie about Demaratus, and the Delphic oracle said that Demaratus was illegitimate, and so he fled to Persia in a huff. So Demaratus, the Spartan king, is working, if you like, for Xerxes because he was thrown out of Sparta. Now, I don't think this is necessarily showing Cleomenes and the Spartan system in that positive a light, showing the Greeks being fraudulent and tricky and deceitful, but it is interesting in that it does show how these kings are not all powerful. You don't have this one completely superior tyrannical overlord king in Sparta. They've got their own kind of vulnerabilities to politics and machinations and things like that. So is there again some kind of difference there? Maybe not. So Demaratus is an important figure and a real figure, but I think his importance lies in, again, that kind of Greek foil to the Persian values that are expressed by Xerxes and others on campaign. So he was real. It is a sort of real historical figure who did go and join the Persians, but remember, the speeches that he pushes forward, Herodotus would have had no idea whether he said anything like that, and would have had no idea what Xerxes said, and so on and so forth. So Herodotus is creating these conversations to deliberately show the difference between Greeks and Persians. So what I would like you to do now is read 7.101 to 105 and identify at least 10 quotes that help explore the difference between Greeks and barbarians. So that will take a little while, probably 10 to 15 minutes. So pause the video, read through 7.101 to 105, and remember the things that we're looking for. What sort of barbaric values are we seeing? Hubris for the barbarians? Are we seeing an understanding of the gods by the Greeks? Are we seeing bravery? Are we seeing cowardice? Are we seeing wisdom? Are we seeing stupidity? Are we seeing balance? Are we seeing excess? What is going on? Have a look at 7.101 to 105. Identify at least 10 quotes that explore the difference between the Greeks and barbarians and say why. So don't just write the quote, and this is why it does what it does. Very good. So let's have a look at my 10. So straight away, we've got a crucial quote that really sums up the difference between the Greeks and Persians and highlights one of the fundamental flaws in the Persian political system. Demaratus, powerful Spartan, asking Xerxes, "Do you want a truthful answer, O king, or a pleasing one?" And he's not even being subtle about it. He's saying, "Look, do you want the truth, or do you want me to flatter you? What are you in the mood for today?" And this is shocking. When you think about the debate in the Athenian assembly, the truthfulness and directness of the Spartans with each other, the cut and thrust of debate between Spartan kings, this is this sign that Xerxes will sort of kill you again if you displease him, is is staggering. So Demarastus is saying, look, if you want the truth, you have to kind of promise not to kill me. Basically, is what's going on here. So again, this is complete lack of freedom to speak, and also the consequences of it are that you make terrible decisions. A point made a while back by Artabanus in the debate. So on to 7.102. So Demaratus again double checks, because this is obviously such an issue with the Persian political system, such an issue with Xerxes. So again in 7.102 he says, so your orders are that I should speak the truth. So you sure you definitely want me to tell the truth? Now he then moves on to talk about poverty in Greece, and he says poverty is endemic to Greece. So Demaratus is pushing forward this idea that tough lands make tough people, soft lands make soft people. And again, it also highlights the insanity of the Persians in invading Greece. They have got Persia, they've got Asia, they've got this vast, wealthy, luxurious area full of food, full of gold, full of everything they could possibly want, and yet they have stripped the area barren, stripped it of men, resources, equipment, all just to invade this rocky, hostile land of Greece. So it points to Persian ridiculousness, but it also hints at Greek toughness. Poverty is endemic to Greece. Poverty makes hard men. Demaratus also points out that the Greeks, and he says that I'm only speaking for the Spartans. So this is a bit of a kind of focus on the Spartans, but I think we do get the sense that really he's speaking in some senses for all Greeks. He says the Greeks are forged by wisdom and strength of law. So what is it that's important about the Greeks? It is not wealth, it's not numbers, it's wisdom and the strength of law. Now he then goes on to make a very, very important point, that for the Spartans it makes no difference whether they have 1,000 men or more or less, they will fight you. And this is not something that Xerxes can understand, that 1,000 Spartan men would just fight however many Persians were there. And you can see how he can't get his head around it. So because he's saying, well, so if you're king and you have to fight more than double, then you have to count this much. So it's a weird mathematical exercise for Xerxes, because Xerxes is never going to do any fighting. He sits on a throne at the back and instructs while his men go out to fight. And again, here we're seeing the real difference between Greek and Persian leadership. So Xerxes is on a throne at the back. The Spartan kings are at the front, fighting double the number of enemies. So you just couldn't get a clearer difference in terms of leadership and values, but also motivations. The Spartans will be fighting the Persians. It doesn't matter whether there's one Spartan, 1,000 or 10,000, and it doesn't matter whether there's one Persian, 1 million or 5 million. The Spartans will fight. And again, Xerxes does not get this. He's convinced that the Spartans and the Greeks as a whole will run away when they see the size of his army. So Xerxes, as we talked about in the previous slide, is just flabbergasted by this whole business. As a king, you would be expected to take on double the number of opponents. What a ridiculous concept or idea. The whole point of being a king is that you don't have to take on anyone. As we said, you just can't get a more different understanding of leadership and manliness than Xerxes and the Spartans. And he also shows he doesn't understand what motivates the Spartans and the Greeks. He says if they had one man set over them, maybe prompted by their dread of this one powerful tyrant, they could be made to fight the Persians effectively. So he thinks the only way of governing is one man with total power. And the only reason that people fight effectively is being prompted by dread of this man with total power. He doesn't understand how Greeks can fight for freedom. He doesn't understand how Greeks can fight for their polis and out of a sense of manliness and bravery, and for their religion and their temples and their gods and their language and their culture. He doesn't understand that, or rather he thinks, even if he does sort of at least potentially understand it, he thinks it's a far inferior motivation to fighting out of fear, being whipped forward by the sort of the whips of a totalitarian dictator. So just the complete opposite to the Greeks. And he goes on to say, you talk nothing but nonsense. He's convinced that the Greeks, even the Spartans, will all run away when faced with his famous Persian immortals. And as we'll see a little bit later on, that is very much not the case. Now, Demaratus responds and points out that the Spartans are, amazing soldiers, but then highlights one really important Greek value: unity. As a collective, they fight better than any men on earth. So here he's making reference to the Spartan phalanx, the hoplite phalanx, and we can probably extend this to a kind of more general description of the Greeks. What gives the Greeks, in this case specifically the Spartans, their power is the discipline, the unity, and the organisation. As a collective, they fight better than any man on earth. Again, Xerxes doesn't get this. The Persians are sent forward and the barbarians are sent forward in these massive hordes, massive waves. There's no sense of real discipline or unity or fighting as a collective. It's almost a sort of million individuals that are being whipped on to attack the enemy. Now, the next thing that Demaratus points out is one of your sort of crucial quotes. All of these quotes are important, but this is a really good one. Their master is law, and of that they are far more afraid than your men are of you. So that's such a powerful and important idea, isn't it? The Spartans are, the only thing they fear is breaking the law. The only thing they fear is not doing their duty under the law to Sparta, and they're much more terrified of that failure than Xerxes' men are terrified of being killed by him. It's just a world apart, isn't it? On one hand, you've got a society with, in a sense, no law or no consistent law. People are driven forward and fight out of fear. And on the other side, you've got a society that is obsessed with law, and they fight out of a fear of failure to meet the requirements and standards of that law. And in a more specific sense for the Spartans, the law is basically either win or die. That's the Spartan law on the battlefield: either triumph or be annihilated. And remember, thinking back to Mardonius in the debate previously, he doesn't understand what's happening with all these Greeks who just stand there and die and fight, and no one runs away, and even the winners take such heavy casualties they may as well be the losers. But this is, the Spartan and this Greek idea of, not running away, not showing cowardice. It doesn't matter how many people you're facing. It doesn't matter, how many people you've got. It is about the motivation of fighting for freedom, and especially for the Spartans, obeying the law. And we'll see how important that is to the Spartans at the end of Thermopylae. Now, Demaratus has criticised Xerxes and pointed out all of the things that are wrong with his idea. And it's interesting in Herodotus 7:105 that Xerxes isn't angered by this. Far from being angered, Xerxes instead made a joke of it. Now, this is interesting because think about what happened with Artabanus. So Artabanus contradicts Xerxes and is threatened with death if he wasn't his uncle, and rage and fury and humiliation. So that's what happens when you contradict Xerxes one day, and then the next day, when Demaratus criticizes Xerxes, it's it's a joke. Doesn't matter. He's so wild, he's so unpredictable, and this is depicting him as this passionate, impetuous, barbarian with no sense of restraint and no consistency. I suppose in a sense, from a Greek perspective, it would almost be better if every single day it was don't take the piss out of Xerxes or you get your head cut off. This sort of complete unpredictability, is that a word? Unpredictability? This complete unpredictability, makes him even more barbaric. One day it's I'll cut your head off, the next day, good gag, but I don't believe you. So this scene with Herodotus and Demaratus, I'm sure you've picked out a lot more to it, and do learn this one inside out. But those are some crucial details that we see from that. Now, if you have got 15 minutes left, I think this would be a good one to try. Could have been quite a long lesson so far, so I will trust that you will write this if there is appropriate time. How does Herodotus depict the extent of Xerxes' hubris? Now think about this in what we've looked at so far. Building bridges, canals, the size and scale of the army, the behaviour of the army, his behaviour in debate, etc. There is so much there. 7 or 8 points, 15 minutes, handed in with the assignment, and that is it. Well done, guys. Take care, and I'll see you in the next lesson.